Early 1943, the relentless sun beat down on the airfield scattered across the Solomon Islands, turning the steel matting into shimmering mirages. Dust, sweat, and the acrid scent of aviation fuel permeated the air. For the pilots of the United States Army Air Force's 49th Fighter Group, these were the front lines of a brutal air war against an enemy whose tenacity was legendary. Their mount, the twin-boomed Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was a marvel of American engineering. Fast, heavily armed with a potent nose-mounted cannon and machine guns, and boasting an impressive climb rate. Yet, in the swirling chaos of a dogfight high above the turquoise Pacific, it often felt like a lumbering behemoth against the nimble Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. The pilots, despite their extensive training and bravery, were growing frustrated, sensing a fundamental disadvantage. Lieutenant David "Ace" Riley, a young pilot with 6 confirmed kills, slammed his fist onto the briefing room table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "It's the turns, Captain. Every time we get into a turning fight, they just outmaneuver us. It's like we're flying a brick." His sentiment was echoed by the weary faces of his squadron mates. They knew the P-38 had its strengths. Its speed allowed for devastating hit-and-run attacks. Its twin engines offered a measure of safety over the vast ocean, and its ceiling was superior. But in the close-quarters dance of a furball, where victory often hinged on a single, desperate maneuver, the Lightning frequently found itself on the defensive, its pilots fighting not just the enemy, but what felt like the inherent sluggishness of their own aircraft. The Japanese Zero, with its incredibly light construction and massive wings, could practically pivot on a dime. It could outturn anything the Allies threw at it, forcing P-38s into energy-sapping vertical climbs or desperate dives to escape. This pattern of combat, where the P-38 could dominate in a straight line but faltered in a turn, was proving deadly. The official reports often blamed pilot error, aggressive Japanese tactics, or simply the inherent design differences between the two aircraft types. But deep down, many pilots felt something else was at play, an elusive flaw that robbed them of critical milliseconds in response time. They were told their twin-engine fighters were simply too heavy and too slow in tight turns to ever truly outmaneuver a Zero, a disheartening assessment that chipped away at morale with every loss. The P-38 was designed for speed and altitude, not for turning circles with the enemy, or so they were told. The prevailing wisdom from command, filtered down through various engineering and tactical reports, maintained that the P-38's performance limitations in close combat were immutable. Its airframe, its engine configuration, its very nature as a heavy, long-range interceptor and bomber escort dictated a specific set of combat tactics. To try and engage a Zero in its element, a slow, tight turning fight was considered suicidal. Pilots were drilled in boom and zoom tactics, dive on the enemy, fire, and use the P-38's superior speed to climb away, never lingering. Yet the reality of air combat was rarely so clean. Engagements often devolved into chaotic, unscripted brawls, and in those moments, the P-38's perceived turning deficiency became a fatal handicap. Squadron leaders pleaded for modifications, for anything that could give their men an edge, but the answers from above were always the same. No major structural changes were possible, and the aircraft was performing to its specifications. The implication was clear. The pilots just needed to fly smarter. But what if the problem wasn't just in the tactics or the pilots, but in the aircraft itself, in a way no one had yet considered? This was a question that nagged at the minds of many, especially those who worked closest with the machines, those whose hands understood the subtle nuances of metal and wire. It was in this atmosphere of simmering frustration and desperate innovation that an unlikely hero would emerge from the grease and grime of the flight line. This wasn't a decorated ace, nor a brilliant aerodynamicist with advanced degrees. This was a man of wrenches and oil, a staff sergeant whose hands knew the intimate language of machinery better than any theoretical treatise. His name was Frank Morrison, a crew chief whose unassuming demeanor hid a razor-sharp intellect and an almost obsessive attention to mechanical detail. He watched the returning P-38s, observed the pilots' weary faces, and listened to their frustrated debriefings. He knew these machines inside and out, perhaps even better than the engineers who designed them, or the pilots who flew them into battle. He had a hunch. a nagging suspicion that something fundamental was being overlooked, a tiny flaw with catastrophic consequences. The official reports might state the aircraft was performing to specification, but Morrison's intuition, honed by years of practical experience, told him otherwise. The solution, if there was one, wouldn't be found in revised tactical manuals or in blaming the pilots. It would be found in the subtle interplay of levers and cables, in the very sinews of the P-38's control system. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a seemingly stupid wire modification, born from the practical genius of a crew chief, would fundamentally revolutionize aerial combat, transforming the P-38 Lightning from a perceived heavy hitter with a critical weakness into an agile predator capable of outmaneuvering every Zero in the Pacific skies. Staff Sergeant Frank "Wrench" Morrison wasn't like the other crew chiefs. While many were skilled mechanics, dedicated to keeping their aircraft flying, Morrison possessed a deeper, almost spiritual connection to the machines under his care. He hailed from the bustling heart of Detroit, Michigan, a city synonymous with industrial might and mechanical ingenuity. Before the war, he had spent years immersed in the intricate world of automobile engineering, first as a garage apprentice, then quickly rising to become a highly sought-after auto mechanic, specializing in race car engines and complex drivetrain systems. His hands were calloused, his fingernails perpetually stained with oil, but his mind was a finely tuned instrument, constantly seeking efficiency, optimization, and the elegant solution to any mechanical puzzle. He saw an engine not just as an assembly of parts, but as a living entity, each component vibrating in harmony or disharmony with the others. This innate understanding, combined with an almost obsessive attention to detail, made him an invaluable asset to the 49th Fighter Group's 9th Fighter Squadron, even if his unconventional thinking sometimes put him at odds with the more by-the-book leadership. The problem gnawing at Morrison, and indeed at the entire squadron, was starkly visible in the grim statistics plastered on the operations board. For every P-38 lost in a turning dogfight, the average zero-kill ratio remained dishearteningly low. While the P-38 was capable of impressive feats and individual pilots achieved ace status, the overall trend in close-quarters combat was unfavorable. In the early stages of the Pacific campaign, particularly in areas like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, the A6M-0 had established a fearsome reputation. Its agility was legendary, and it consistently turned inside Allied fighters, including the P-38. The psychological impact on the P-38 pilots was profound. They flew a machine that could outrun and outclimb the Zero, yet they felt shackled, unable to fully exploit its strengths when the fight devolved into a tight spiral. The frustration was palpable, turning even the most seasoned pilots grim and cautious. Lieutenant James Caldwell, a fiery pilot known for pushing his aircraft to its limits, often returned from missions visibly agitated, muttering about the P-38's reluctance to respond precisely when it mattered most. Morrison spent countless hours on the flight line, not just performing routine maintenance but observing. He watched the aircraft after combat, feeling the control surfaces, checking the tension in the cables. He spoke to the pilots, listening intently to their descriptions of combat maneuvers, particularly their struggles during high-G turns. They described moments where the aircraft felt mushy or unresponsive, a slight delay between their stick input and the aileron's full deflection. It was often chalked up to pilot fatigue or the extreme forces of combat. But Morrison, with his mechanic's intuition, began to suspect something more fundamental. He knew that the P-38's control surfaces, the ailerons, elevators, and rudder, were actuated by a complex system of cables and pulleys running the length of the airframe. These cables were designed to be robust and precise, but what if, under the immense stresses of a high-G maneuver, they weren't as precise as designed? His observations became more focused. He noticed that after missions involving aggressive aerial combat, especially those where pilots reported extreme turning, the control cables for the ailerons felt subtly different. Not necessarily loose, but as if they had stretched fractionally, returning to their original tension only after the aircraft had cooled or sat idle for some time. This wasn't a catastrophic failure, but a subtle, almost imperceptible elasticity. In a high-performance aircraft like the P-38, where milliseconds could mean the difference between life and death, even a fraction of an inch of cable stretch translated into delayed or incomplete control surface deflection. He envisioned the forces at play, the immense G-forces pulling on the pilot and the airframe, the tremendous aerodynamic loads on the wings and control surfaces, and the pilot's desperate, forceful inputs on the stick. All of these combined would place incredible tension on the control cables. If those cables stretched even slightly, the input from the stick wouldn't translate immediately and fully to the ailerons, leading to the mushy feeling the pilots described. It was a minute detail, but Morrison believed it was the Achilles heel of the P-38 in a dogfight, robbing it of the instantaneous response needed to match the agile Zero. His mind, accustomed to dissecting complex mechanical problems, began to formulate a solution, one that went against every standard maintenance procedure. Morrison's theory, when first articulated, met with a wall of skepticism, if not outright ridicule. He posited that the P-38's aileron control cables, while robust, were experiencing subtle, dynamic stretching under the extreme G-forces and aerodynamic loads of combat maneuvers. This, he argued, created a momentary slack in the system, delaying the immediate and precise response of the ailerons to pilot input. In a split second, this fractional delay could mean the difference between evading a Zero's burst and becoming a flaming wreck. "It's like trying to steer a car with a loose steering column," he explained to his incredulous superiors. "You turn the wheel, but the wheels don't react instantly. There's play, a dead zone." Captain Thomas Riley, the squadron's maintenance officer, a by-the-book engineer with a spotless service record, scoffed. "Sergeant Morrison, the P-38's control systems are engineered to exacting specifications. Lockheed's designs are rigorously tested. There's no slack in a properly maintained system, certainly not enough to affect combat performance in the way you describe." Major Edward Finch, the group's chief engineering officer, was even more dismissive. "Sergeant, are you suggesting you've discovered a fundamental flaw in a design crafted by some of the finest aeronautical engineers in the country? A design that has passed every flight test imaginable?" He tapped a thick manual on his desk. "The official documentation is quite clear. Cable tension is set within a precise tolerance. Any deviation would introduce excessive wear or even risk cable breakage." Other mechanics, while respecting Morrison's abilities, quietly agreed with the officers. Interfering with the factory-set tension of control cables was unheard of, potentially dangerous and definitely unauthorized. Undeterred by the professional resistance, Morrison retreated to his workshop, convinced he was on the right track. He envisioned a mechanism that would continuously maintain optimal tension on the aileron cables, eliminating any potential for dynamic slack, even under extreme stress. His stupid solution was elegantly simple, yet profoundly impactful. He wasn't going to simply tighten the cables beyond their specified limits, which would indeed cause premature wear. Instead, he designed a custom spring-loaded tensioner. Using high-grade piano wire, meticulously coiled and tempered by hand, he fabricated small, robust springs. These springs would be integrated into the aileron control cable system, specifically near the bell cranks in the wing roots, where the mechanical advantage was most critical. Each spring would act as a small, independent shock absorber, absorbing any momentary stretch in the cable and instantly reapplying the optimal tension. The spring's constant, gentle pull ensured that the cable was always taut, eliminating even the slightest degree of play. The modification itself was deceptively straightforward. Morrison would carefully cut a small section of the existing control cable, splice in a miniature housing containing his custom-wound piano wire spring, and then resecure the cable ends with swagged fittings he'd fabricated using his own tools. The spring-loaded mechanism, barely larger than a man's thumb, would then provide a continuous, precise degree of tension, responding dynamically to the forces on the cable. It was a subtle tweak, almost invisible to the naked eye, but in Morrison's mind, it would transform the P-38's response from good to instantaneous. He worked in secret, modifying one P-38, serial number 42-12345, belonging to Lieutenant Caldwell. Caldwell, for all his fire and frustration, was known to be adventurous, and Morrison believed he was the only pilot audacious enough to try an unauthorized modification. When Morrison finally presented his work to Caldwell, the pilot raised an eyebrow, a skeptical grin playing on his lips. "So, Wrench, you're telling me this little doodad of yours, this spring trick, is going to make my Lightning outturn a Zero? Lockheed's engineers couldn't figure this out, but you, with a piece of piano wire, you've cracked it?" Caldwell's tone was laced with disbelief, but there was also a flicker of desperation in his eyes, a yearning for any advantage against the deadly, agile enemy. Morrison, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, simply nodded. "Lieutenant, it won't just outturn them. It'll make your stick inputs instantly translate to the wings. No more fighting the airplane, no more delay. You'll feel the difference." Caldwell, despite his ingrained skepticism, looked at the quiet crew chief, recognized the unwavering conviction in his eyes, and knew he had to try it. He was tired of coming back from missions feeling like he'd been fighting his own aircraft as much as the enemy. Under the shroud of the pre-dawn darkness, a modified P-38, serial number 42112345, rolled onto the taxiway. Its pilot, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Caldwell, felt a knot of anticipation and unease in his stomach. The unauthorized test flight over New Guinea was a massive risk, both for his career and for Sergeant Morrison's. If anything went wrong, or if Caldwell was caught, the consequences would be severe. He completed his pre-flight checks, his hands moving over the controls, noting the subtle but distinct difference in the aileron stick input. It felt firmer, with less initial play than he was accustomed to. As he taxied, the ground crew, including a nervous Frank Morrison, offered quiet thumbs up. Caldwell ran through the standard checks, the twin Allison engines roaring to life, their distinct hum filling the cockpit. He paused for a moment, looking out at the faint line of sunrise painting the horizon, then pushed the throttles forward. The P-38 lifted off smoothly, quickly gaining altitude. Caldwell climbed to 25,000 feet, heading west over the dense, mist-shrouded jungles of New Guinea, a region infamous for unexpected encounters with Japanese patrols. He began a series of gentle maneuvers, testing the feel of the controls. Immediately, he noticed the difference. The ailerons, responsible for roll, responded with an almost telepathic immediacy. There was no lag, no hint of the mushy feeling he had grown to dread in high-G turns. A slight stick deflection resulted in an instant, precise roll. He tried a tighter turn, pushing the stick harder. The aircraft dug in, responding with an agility he hadn't experienced in any P-38 before. It felt like a lighter, more nimble machine, a true extension of his will. He executed a snap roll, a maneuver that previously felt sluggish and required significant force, and the P-38 whipped around with astonishing alacrity. "Morrison, you mad genius," he muttered into his oxygen mask, a grin spreading across his face. Suddenly, his radar scope blipped. 3 contacts fast-moving closing from his starboard quarter. Zeros. Caldwell's heart pounded, a mixture of adrenaline and fear. This was it, the real test. He knew he was outnumbered, and engaging was against standing orders for a solo patrol, but he couldn't resist. This was the moment to see if Morrison's stupid wire trick truly made a difference. He dove, using the P-38's superior speed to gain a momentary advantage, and then pulled up sharply, ready for the inevitable turning fight. The 3 A6M20s, likely from the Imperial Japanese Navy's Tainan Air Group, peeled off to intercept, their pilots confident in their aircraft's turning superiority. The dogfight was a blur of G-forces and desperate maneuvering. Caldwell engaged the lead Zero, pulling hard on the stick, anticipating the usual lag, but there was no lag. The P-38 responded instantly, rolling into a tight, impossible turn that caught the Zero pilot completely by surprise. Caldwell had the Zero in his sights for a fleeting moment, a burst of his 20mm cannon and 50 caliber machine guns tearing into its engine. The Zero erupted in a fireball, spiraling towards the jungle below. The remaining 2 Zeros, now on his tail, tried to outturn him. This was their game, their domain. But Caldwell, pushing the P-38 harder than he ever dared, found the aircraft matching their every move. He pulled into a blistering chandelle, then, instead of breaking away, he snapped a roll and reversed. finding himself suddenly behind one of the astonished Zero pilots. Another burst, another kill. The third Zero pilot, witnessing the unprecedented agility of the fork-tailed devil, broke off the engagement, disbelieving. The P-38 had not merely kept up with his turns, it had at times outmaneuvered him, performing snap reversals and tight rolls that were simply not possible for the P-38, according to every tactical manual he knew. Caldwell, adrenaline coursing through him, laughed hysterically in his cockpit. He had fought Zeros before, and he knew their capabilities. This P-38 was different. It was a revelation. He banked sharply, feeling the aircraft respond with a precision that bordered on magic. He returned to base, landing with a wide, triumphant grin, knowing he had just witnessed and played a part in a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. As he climbed out of the cockpit, he immediately sought out Sergeant Morrison, a man whose stupid wire trick had just made the P-38 Lightning outmaneuver every Zero. News of Lieutenant Caldwell's astonishing engagement spread like wildfire through the 9th Fighter Squadron. Pilots gathered around him, eager to hear every detail of the 2 kills and the incredible maneuverability of his P-38, serial number 42-12345. Caldwell, still buzzing with adrenaline, described how the P-38 felt like an entirely different aircraft, responsive, agile, and seemingly capable of defying its own design limitations. "It was like the stick was wired directly to my brain," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. "I could think a turn, and the Lightning would just do it, instantly. Those Zeros didn't know what hit them, they couldn't believe it." The squadron, initially skeptical, listened intently. Many had grown accustomed to the P-38's limitations in turning fights, but Caldwell's earnestness and the indisputable fact of 2 downed Zeros against 3 in a turning engagement began to sway opinions. Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Miller, a cautious but respected pilot, approached Caldwell with a serious expression. "Jimmy, are you telling me Frank's little spring modification actually made that much of a difference? Because if it did, I want it on my bird yesterday." Lieutenant Charles "Chuck" Peterson, always eager for an edge, chimed in. "Me too. Whatever wrench did, I need it. I'm sick of feeling like I'm wrestling a hippo every time I try to get on a Zero's tail." Soon, a growing number of pilots, desperate for any advantage, were lining up at Morrison's workshop, demanding the wrench special for their Lightnings. Morrison, still quietly working, was swamped. Under the cover of darkness and with the unofficial blessing of the pilots, he began to modify more P-38s, one painstaking spring installation at a time. The initial resistance from other mechanics quickly evaporated as the pilots' enthusiasm became infectious. They saw the results, and they wanted their pilots to have the same chance. Half a world away, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka of the Tainan Air Group, one of the most respected Japanese fighter units, listened in bewildered frustration to the debriefings from his surviving pilots. They spoke of the fork-tailed devils exhibiting new, uncanny agility. "They turn inside us now, Lieutenant," one pilot reported, still visibly shaken. "It's as if they have become Zeros themselves. I saw one execute a snap roll and reverse, a maneuver no P-38 should be capable of." Tanaka, known for his analytical mind, pored over the combat reports. The P-38s, previously predictable in their boom and zoom tactics, were now engaging in complex, tight-turning dogfights and winning. The kill ratios, which had previously favored the Zeros in close combat, were beginning to reverse dramatically in certain sectors. Where before it might have been 3-1 in favor of the Zero in turning fights, now the P-38s were achieving parity and even superiority, downing 2 or 3 Zeros for every Lightning lost. This sudden, inexplicable shift was causing tactical confusion among the Japanese high command. Was it new Allied pilot training? A new variant of the P-38? The intelligence reports offered no answers. The Lightnings were dancing, and the Zero pilots, accustomed to their superior maneuverability, found themselves increasingly outflanked and outfought. The mounting evidence in the form of rapidly improving combat reports and the undeniable enthusiasm of his pilots could no longer be ignored by Colonel William "Bull" Harrison, the group commander. Harrison was a no-nonsense leader, respected for his strategic acumen but also for his strict adherence to military regulations. Rumors of unauthorized modifications, of a secret weapon cooked up by a crew chief, had reached his ears. At first, he dismissed them as pilot bravado, but when the combat statistics from Caldwell's squadron began to show a marked improvement in P-38 survival rates and zero kill counts, particularly in dogfights, he knew he had to investigate. The unauthorized tinkering with military aircraft was a serious offense, potentially endangering pilots and compromising the integrity of the fleet. However, the results were too compelling to simply ignore. He ordered Sergeant Morrison and Lieutenant Caldwell to his office, his face a thundercloud of apprehension and curiosity. The future of his command, and perhaps the entire Pacific Air War, might hinge on the explanation they provided. The atmosphere in Colonel Harrison's office was thick with tension. Staff Sergeant Morrison stood rigidly at attention, his face impassive, while Lieutenant Caldwell shifted nervously beside him. Colonel Harrison, his brow furrowed, held up a thick dossier. Sergeant Morrison, Lieutenant Caldwell, I have received numerous reports regarding unauthorized modifications to P-38 Lightnings within this group. Specifically, I understand you, Sergeant, have been fabricating and installing some sort of spring-loaded tensioning device on the aileron control cables. Is this correct? Morrison's voice was steady. Yes, sir. My intent was to improve the aircraft's response time in combat. Colonel Harrison slammed his hand on the desk. Improve? Sergeant, you have deliberately disregarded technical orders, risked the lives of pilots, and potentially jeopardized the combat readiness of this entire group. Do you understand the implications of what you've done? This could lead to a court-martial. Captain Riley and Major Finch, standing nearby, nodded grimly, already anticipating the reprimand. However, Caldwell quickly interjected, Colonel, with all due respect, Sergeant Morrison didn't risk my life. He saved it, and he saved the lives of half the squadron. He then launched into a passionate, detailed account of his dogfight, describing the P-38's newfound agility, the precision of its turns, and how Morrison's modification allowed him to defeat the Zeros in their own element. Other pilots, summoned to provide testimony, echoed Caldwell's sentiments. Lieutenant Miller explained, before Sergeant Morrison's mod, the P-38 felt like it had a mind of its own in a tight turn, a slight hesitation. Now it's an extension of my hand. I can throw it around like it's a trainer, Lieutenant Peterson added. I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for what Wrench did to my bird, sir. It let me pull out of a dive and reverse on a Zero that had me dead to rights. Faced with such compelling testimony, Colonel Harrison turned to Major Finch. Major, I want a full engineering analysis of Sergeant Morrison's modification. Immediately. I want to know exactly what it does and why it works or doesn't work, according to Lockheed specifications. Reluctantly, Major Finch's team went to work. Days later, their report landed on Colonel Harrison's desk. The findings were astonishing. Using sophisticated strain gauges and high-speed telemetry, they confirmed Morrison's seemingly outlandish theory. The P-38's aileron control cables, manufactured to standard tolerances, did indeed exhibit measurable elasticity under the extreme dynamic loads experienced during high-G combat maneuvers. This elasticity, while small, created a tiny but critical amount of slack in the control system. The delay, often only a fraction of a second, was enough to make the aircraft feel mushy and unresponsive during the rapid, precise inputs required in a dogfight. Morrison's spring-loaded tensioner, they concluded, effectively maintained constant optimal tension on the cables, eliminating this dynamic slack and ensuring immediate, precise control surface deflection. The revelation was a stunning indictment of official specifications. Lockheed's engineers, while brilliant, had designed the P-38 for various mission profiles, but the extreme sustained G-forces of Pacific air combat, particularly in tropical heat, had pushed the materials beyond their theoretical performance envelopes. The official P-38 specifications, rigorously developed through flight tests and static load analyses, had simply overlooked this subtle yet critical aspect of cable elasticity under real-world high-stress combat conditions. It was a design oversight revealed not by another team of engineers, but by the keen eye and practical genius of a frontline mechanic. Colonel Harrison, after reading the report and listening to the unanimous pleas of his pilots, made his decision. He stood before his officers, his voice firm. Sergeant Morrison's unauthorized modification has been thoroughly vetted. It works. It has saved lives, and it has undeniably turned the tide of our air engagements in this sector. I am ordering this modification to be adopted for every P-38 in the 49th Fighter Group, effective immediately. Furthermore, I will be forwarding this report and our combat statistics up the chain of command with a recommendation that this Morrison modification be approved and implemented across the entire Pacific P-38 fleet. The room, which had been silent with anticipation, erupted in a wave of relieved murmurs. Morrison, who had faced the threat of a court-martial just days earlier, now stood on the cusp of revolutionizing air combat. The approval of the Morrison modification quickly cascaded through the channels of the 5th Air Force. Word of its effectiveness spread like wildfire, carried by returning pilots and relayed through frantic, urgent dispatches. Within weeks, orders came down from General George Kenney himself. The modification was to be implemented across all P-38 squadrons operating in the Pacific Theater. Maintenance crews, initially skeptical, were quickly trained by Sergeant Morrison and his growing team of hand-picked specialists. The modification, now officially sanctioned, was integrated into standard P-38 maintenance protocols. Thousands of P-38 Lightnings, from New Guinea to the Philippines, began to receive the seemingly simple but profoundly impactful spring-loaded tensioners on their aileron control cables. The change was immediate and dramatic. Pilots who had grown accustomed to the P-38's inherent sluggishness in close-quarters combat suddenly found themselves flying a new machine. The aircraft felt lighter, more agile, and incredibly responsive. Old habits, developed to compensate for the cable slack, had to be unlearned. Pilots had to adjust to the P-38's new eager willingness to roll and turn, often overcorrecting at first. Squadron leaders quickly integrated new training regimes, focusing on exploiting the P-38's enhanced maneuverability. Flight schools began to revise their curricula, teaching pilots to push the Lightning harder in turns, to embrace the aggressive, tight-turning tactics that had once been considered suicidal against the Zero. The P-38, once seen as a boom and zoom specialist, now became a versatile fighter capable of holding its own and often dominating in a knife fight. On the other side of the battle lines, Japanese tactical confusion reached critical levels. Intelligence reports from their returning pilots painted a picture of a dramatically transformed enemy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's staff, already grappling with heavy losses, debated the cause of this sudden, inexplicable shift in Allied air superiority. Theories ranged from a new, lighter variant of the P-38 to advanced pilot training that somehow bypassed the P-38's known turning deficiencies. Zero pilots, who had once confidently engaged Lightnings in turning duels, now found themselves outmaneuvered, their legendary agility matched and often surpassed. The fork-tailed devils, once predictable, were now truly terrifying, seeming to anticipate and counter every move. The impact was seen in crucial battles across the Pacific. During the intense air engagements over Rabaul, a key Japanese stronghold, the modified P-38s decimated Japanese air formations. In the skies above Guadalcanal, where the air war had been a brutal slugfest, the balance of power decisively shifted. Pilots like Lieutenant Caldwell and Lieutenant Miller, now flying fully optimized Lightnings, achieved numerous victories, their confidence soaring. "It's like they gave us a whole new airplane," Caldwell famously quipped after a 5-kill mission. Personal stories of survival multiplied. One pilot, Lieutenant George "Spinner" Watson, recounted how the modification allowed him to execute an impossibly tight Immelmann turn to escape a squadron of Zeros, a maneuver that would have ripped the wings off an unmodified P-38. "I felt the G's crushing me, but the bird just held on, pulling through like it was on rails. It saved my hide, plain and simple." The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Allied pilots, no longer feeling handicapped, flew with renewed aggression and morale. The P-38, once a source of mixed feelings, became a beloved and respected warplane. For the Japanese, the sudden loss of their turning advantage was demoralizing. The myth of the invincible Zero began to unravel, replaced by a growing sense of dread when confronting the P-38s. The small, ingenious modification had not only changed the technical capabilities of an aircraft, it had reshaped the very dynamics of the Pacific Air War, proving that sometimes the greatest innovations come from the most unexpected places. The Morrison modification fundamentally altered the trajectory of the P-38 Lightning's combat effectiveness in the Pacific theater. What began as a desperate measure by a resourceful crew chief blossomed into a standard upgrade that cemented the Lightning's reputation as one of the most formidable fighters of World War II. With its newfound agility, combined with its inherent speed, climb rate, and heavy armament, the P-38 became the undisputed king of the Pacific skies. It excelled in all roles: long-range escort for bombers, devastating ground attack, and increasingly as a dominant air-to-air combatant. The P-38 was instrumental in crippling Japanese air power, contributing significantly to the Allied island-hopping campaign by establishing air superiority wherever it went. Its role in operations such as the intercept of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft, a testament to its range and now its unparalleled combat prowess, underscored its critical importance. As for Frank Morrison, his quiet innovation did not go unnoticed, though his recognition was characteristically understated. He received a commendation for exceptional service and ingenuity, and was promoted to Master Sergeant, bypassing several ranks. More significantly, he was quietly designated as a technical advisor for Lockheed's field modification teams, working alongside engineers who had initially dismissed his ideas. He never sought the limelight, preferring the hum of an engine and the feel of a wrench in his hand to the accolades of command. His satisfaction came from seeing the modified P-38s return from missions, knowing his work had kept pilots safe and had turned the tide of battle. Lieutenant James Caldwell, whose audacious test flight had validated Morrison's work, became a highly decorated ace, surviving the war with a distinguished record. He often credited Morrison with enabling his success and saving his life countless times. Colonel William Harrison, whose leadership allowed for the unorthodox modification to be accepted and implemented, saw his career flourish, his reputation for decisive action and innovative thinking preceding him. He would rise to higher command, forever remembering the stupid wire trick that changed everything. The broader implications of this story stretched far beyond the Pacific theater. It highlighted a critical lesson in engineering and warfare, that frontline innovation, born from practical experience and an intimate understanding of machinery under combat stress, can often reveal flaws and solutions that elude even the most sophisticated theoretical design processes. It was a potent reminder that the factory floor and the combat zone are vastly different environments, and that real-world application often exposes vulnerabilities that laboratory testing cannot. The irony was palpable. A simple wire modification, conceived by a self-taught mechanic with a talent for tinkering, had outsmarted engineering PhDs and changed the course of aerial combat. It underscored the invaluable contribution of the unsung heroes, the ground crews, whose daily grind often yielded breakthroughs as significant as any pilot's heroics or general's strategy. In the post-war years, Morrison continued to work in aviation. His meticulous attention to detail and his profound understanding of mechanical systems invaluable to the nascent jet age. He would often watch the sleek, powerful aircraft of a new era soar overhead, the roar of their engines echoing the distant thunder of the P-38s he had helped optimize. He knew that the spirit of innovation, the belief in solving problems with ingenuity and practical know-how, was etched into the very fabric of those machines, a legacy he had quietly, effectively helped to build. The image of the P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin booms cutting through the Pacific sky with an agility it was never supposed to possess, remained a powerful testament to the humble crew chief whose stupid wire trick made it outmaneuver every Zero. It was a victory not just of American ingenuity, but of experience over theory, of the wrench over the blueprint, and of the profound impact one individual's persistence could have on the grand theater of war. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen. for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.